And welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, DPRK leader Kim Jong Un has halted his plans to launch missiles toward U.S. bases in Guam. Has Trump's provocative military drills and tough talk paid off? Right-wing protesters and counter-protesters clashed in Virginia, leaving 3 dead. Yet Trump said many sides were to blame. Why is it so hard, some say, for Trump to criticize openly racist Americans? And we begin today's program on the Korean peninsula here in Asia, where a war of words continues between the DPRK and the United States. But there seems to be a new direction, as some suggest. DPRK leaders Kim Jong Un made the plan to nuke the U.S. island of Guam, as he previously claimed, in favor of monitoring U.S. actions. Meanwhile, the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson expressed their willingness to have dialogue with the DPRK. It seems the shadow cast over Northeast Asia has been temporarily dispersed.
A changing tone. Kim Jong Un, the top leader of the DPRK, on Monday praised his army's plans to fire missiles towards the U.S. territory of Guam in the Pacific, but said he would hold off on the launch and continue to monitor U.S. actions. Trump said that Kim has made a wise choice and that the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson expressed their willingness to negotiate.
We continue to be interested in finding a way to get to dialogue, but that's up to him.
Today marks the 100th day since South Korean President Moon Jae-in's inauguration. During a news conference at the presidential office, he declared on Thursday that there would be no second war on the Korean peninsula. This came amid fears that heightened animosity could lead to real fighting.
It is believed that the atmosphere for dialogue can be created if the DPRK at least stops additional provocations. Once conditions for dialogue are created, and if we judge that dialogue will help us improve South-North relations and solve issues of DPRK nuclear program, then I think I can consider sending a special envoy to the DPRK.
Mediation from all sides. The chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joseph Dunford, has arrived in Beijing after his visit to South Korea on Monday and will visit Japan over the next few days. In Beijing, he met with Vice Chairman of China Commission, Fan Changlong. Fan said that military measures must not become an option on the Korean peninsula. Despite the calling for calm from the international community, the escalating tensions have alarmed the neighboring countries, who are now taking more precautions to defend themselves. Japan and the United States are holding a live-fire joint exercise in the northern Japanese city of Inawa, Hokkaido. And next week, South Korea and the United States will conduct joint military drills too. In the face of multiple provocative military drills, will the DPRK act unexpectedly?
For more on DPRK nuclear crisis, we are now joined in our Beijing studio Zhao Tong, who is the associate in Carnegie's nuclear policy program based at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy here in Beijing. Welcome, sir, back to our program. And also joining us in Beijing, Ki-Yun Chang, who is a professor at Tsinghua University and now editor-in-chief with the Force Media. He's also teaching temporarily at Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang. Just came back from a 10-day trip over there in North Korea.
Yes,
joining us in Boston, the United States, Jim Walsh, a security studies program with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The three gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to have all of you here back on World Insight with Tian Wei. Let me begin with you, Professor Chang. What do you make of the change of tones, at least apparently, from Pyongyang, suggesting monitoring U.S. actions when considering further reactions?
I think as everybody talks about August 21st, when the Four Eagle so-called joint U.S.-Korea joint military exercise, if it stops, or if it scales down, or if Washington doesn't bring any three major nuclear weapons machinery into Korean water, Korean area, I think the DPRK won't go further.
All right. Mr. Walsh, there are a lot of ifs, according to Professor Chang, who just came back from North Korea after a 10-day trip there. Do you think those ifs are likely to be what the U.S. having in mind?
I think there's a possibility here. I think the exercises, military exercises, at this late date, when they are slated to start on Monday, they're going forward. Now the question is, will they be the same as they typically are, in which case we will be back and forth action-reaction politics of North Korea on the peninsula. But if the Americans, as your colleague says, scales them back, changes them, does something to send a signal to North Korea that they are that they're willing to pause as well, then there is a chance for dialogue. And I would also note the president's tweet this morning commending Kim Jong Un for showing patience and prudence. So there's a little signal there too. So I think we're going to get the exercises. The question will be, will they be modified in some way, maybe ways we don't even see, that only the parties see, that signals, yes, there's an opening for dialogue.
Very interesting, the word you use, which we might not be able to see, and yet the parties see. That's exactly the question, is it what kinds of actions and reactions and monitoring of what each side are having toward one another when it comes to their options for the next step, or their options for the next step of actions and reactions. Mr. Zhao.
Actually, I think even for North Korea, it would be difficult for North Korea to see what exactly happening during the exercises, because this Freedom Guardian exercise is primarily a computerized simulation exercise among the commanding posts. It's a tabletop exercise. It doesn't really involve a lot of real, live fire, soldiers in the field. So I don't think it's even possible for North Korea to precisely measure the size and the scope of the exercise and compare it with the previous year. I think what more North Korea will be monitored is actually on the American rhetoric, whether the rhetoric has been toned down.
Okay, talking about rhetoric, the rhetoric has been changing directions, at least in words. On Tuesday, Rex Tillerson, the U.S. Secretary of State, said U.S. are replacing the failed policy of strategic patience, which was a phrase used by the previous Obama administration, with a new policy of, quote, strategic accountability. So what is the difference between these two concepts? Pence, another administration official, said the strategic patience was the hope that the marshalling international support would bring an end to the nuclear ambition and the ballistic missile program of DPRK, which clearly has failed with the advent of nuclear weapons tests. While the strategic accountability means continue to working with its allies and partners and to hold nations accountable to their commitments to isolate the nation. Mr. Zhao, I have to go back to you. It sounds, at least from Mr. Pence's explanation, it is rather a policy toward the allies and partners, except DPRK. And yet, the previous argument is it's actually a fight between the United States and the DPRK. They are monitoring each other. They are doing actions and reactions. So will this strategic accountability really work, or is only a sideshow to the real show?
I think it's basically a strategy of shifting burdens, outsourcing American North Korea policy to other countries, basically refusing to take its own accountability to deal with North Korea. There is even report that U.S. is trying to convince South American countries and African to cut relations with North Korea. So it's part of a comprehensive strategy of isolation against North Korea. I think it could be interpreted by North Korea as a strategy similar to regime change, because it's a strategy of complete isolation and embargo.
But then, on the other hand, Mr. Walsh, Rex Tillerson said very clearly it is not about regime change after the so-called strategic accountability was being announced. So what exactly is the purpose where the U.S. will not be able to see what exactly is the purpose of its policy?
Well, I'm going to take a contrarian view here.
Go ahead.
I know they're working very hard to come up with a phrase that's different from strategic patience, because they said strategic patience is dead. But when you break down strategic patience into individual policy tools, it's sort of the same collection of things with a different name, but they're struggling mightily because they want to distinguish what they're doing from what President Obama did. That's always the core rationale for the Trump administration. I do think there is some difference, though. I mean, if President Trump manages to give a green light to new talks, resumption of the six-party talks, bilateral talks through the New York Channel, building on those, whatever. If he does that, that will be different. And that will be consistent with his announced policy review of maximum pressure and engagement. He'll be doing the engagement part of that policy, and I would welcome that. I would say, though, there are some other things he has to do. How about appointing a U.S. ambassador to South Korea, for example? It's very hard to have an effective policy if you don't have your own people on the ground who represent the government. So I think there are a number of things that the Trump administration should be doing, and perhaps they'll be different than strategic patience, but it's only time will tell if that's true.
Of course, anything time will tell, but when you look at the specific meanings of it, that will include the strategic accountability, vigorous enforcement of sanctions, leaving no DPRK source of revenue untouched. In particular, the U.S. will continue to request the Chinese and Russian commitments not to provide the regime with any economic lifelines and to persuade it to abandon its dangerous path, according to the White House. So, exactly, that is not directing at DPRK, but rather going the other way, directing at the partners and the allies who have been working with the United States on the issue of the Korean Peninsula. This is totally different from the so-called strategic patience. Strategic patience is leaving things alone, leaving the DPRK alone, which of course has failed as well. So let me go back to you, Mr. Chang. Is this policy going to work? Because now we see war of words, at least, between DPRK and the United States, not the United States, and also U.S. partners, according to at least the other partners.
As everybody's saying, it's between DPRK and the United States in essence. What I see now is there's a real, I would say, official process to come to an end, the whole 70-year-long the USA and DPRK confrontation.
Why?
I think that it's trying to find ways in which they can, quote-unquote, sit directly with the DPRK. All other gestures, including military actions, in my language, it's actually show. There's any real action will be involved, which will take us into real nuclear war. I don't think that will take place.
All right.
So it's a matter of time. The world will see very soon, sooner than later. The Washington and Pyongyang will sit down and to talk about it.
I understand what Professor Chang here is trying to indicate. Mr. Zhao, is Professor Chang trying to say, whatever it is, whether strategic patience, strategic accountability, strategic inaccountability, just give it a name. It's just a side show of the real show. The real show, according to Professor Chang, is Pyongyang and Washington now are working on different channels, trying to reach a possibility, consensus, best timing, not to lose face for anyone, to come up with a mechanism or timing just to talk to one another. Do you agree with that? Is that happening?
Well, I agree. I agree there is back-channel dialogue ongoing. Mr. Joseph Yun, the American North Korea policy representative, is in touch with his North Korean counterparts. However, what I'm concerned is the U.S. still doesn't have a coherent strategy, and therefore it is sending conflicting signals. On one hand, there's back-channel discussion. On the other hand, U.S. is calling for China and Russia to cut off North Korea's economic lifeline. How wouldn't that be North Korea interpreted as a strategy of?
Well, probably U.S. as the big guy, as the right. Should I say U.S. as the good guy, while China and Russia, South Korea as the bad guys.
But clearly, it's the U.S. that is asking.
Wouldn't that be interesting?
Right, but clearly, it's the U.S. that is asking China and
if that
Russia.
Is looking on surface, probably somebody would reach with that conclusion. Mr. Zhao?
But I think clearly North Korea understands it's the pressure from the U.S. that is making China and Russia.
I think so.
All right, Professor Chang?
I mean, when I said the all show is from Washington, Washington's all military action, in my language, it's a show. I think that already, like James Clapper, U.S. will have to sit directly with the DPRK, not anymore the show going on, including so-called quote-unquote military exercises. I think the DPRK is very serious. If they bring, in my judgment, further military escalation into the Korean Peninsula, as they said, the Hwasong 12, the IRBM, I don't doubt they will not stop firing from, as they said.
All right, but you may know.
As a strong message.
You may know there are counteractions coming from the United States.
Sure.
Mr. Walsh is making others the bad guy, going to make U.S. the good guy to Pyongyang.
I don't know if good cop, bad cop really works here. I think all the countries are being driven by their own national interests. And there does seem to be a move afoot. But let me, and I agree with my colleagues, I don't think war is imminent. I don't think North Korea is going to start a war they know they're going to lose. I hope the U.S. isn't going to start a war. And so I don't think a conflict is likely, but I do think it's dangerous, in part because of what your colleague from Carnegie says, that there are lots of mixed messages going on, and because the leadership involved seems to take one view one day and another view another day. So I do think it's dangerous. I think there's an opportunity here for the parties to sort of push through and go ahead and start talks. But it would not surprise me if we're back to where we were, you know, if we were having this conversation in another 2 weeks and what we've had is exercises followed by a missile test, followed by strong language. We could be right back in the same old quite quickly.
All right, Mr. Zhao here in Beijing. We see the U.S. General Joseph Dunford in Beijing talking to his Chinese military counterpart, also meeting Chinese President Xi Jinping on Thursday. Of course, the Chinese side stated once and again the use of force is not going to be the way to solve the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. And yet the question is how much the U.S. side would buy that, first of all, or North Korea, rather, would buy that. And meanwhile, what would that make China a role to play? On the one hand, being pressured by the United States to put on more sanctions and further sanctions and implementation of sanctions against Pyongyang, but on the other hand, being expected by the other party as one of the sole correlators to talk to Pyongyang.
Well, as we know, one of the results of the meetings between General Fang and General Danford was the two militaries decided to start a strategic dialogue with each other. And the focus of this dialogue would be crisis management between the two militaries, making sure that if there is a contingency on the Korea Peninsula, the two militaries wouldn't misunderstand each other's intentions, and they want to have some good coordination between military actions. That means, I think, the U.S. military is seriously concerned that there might be a chance for military conflict breaking out.
Is China concerned?
I think China is concerned too. Both countries can miscalculate. The U.S. and North Korea can miscalculate and stumble into a military conflict without intentionally seeking a war with each other.
I see. We are really running out of time. Before we go, one sentence only, it has to be short, from every gentleman. What is your general assessment of the situation? Mr. Walsh, begin from you. One sentence only.
I'm pleased that we're at a moment of pause. I hope the parties take advantage of it, but I won't hold my breath.
All right, Professor Zhao.
Peace will be achieved by everybody's best efforts. That's I'm quite sure. Very soon.
Wow. Mr. Zhao.
Well, I'm not sure we are going to repeat this dialogue, this same talking points again, because even though we are out of pause, what is upcoming is higher tensions. I'm afraid if we do not seize this last opportunity to engage, what will face us is going to be more tensions.
Well said. When the opportunity appeared before, people didn't catch up with those opportunities. I hope this time we, all of us, all the parties involved would, including particularly the United States and North Korea. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Zhao Tong, Ki Yong Chang, and also Jim Walsh. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on our program. Right-wing protesters and counter-protesters clashed in Virginia, leaving 3 dead. That was the news. And yet, the latest, Trump avoided denouncing the white nationalists, saying there were fine people on both sides. Is there a moral equivalence between white supremacists and those who oppose them? We're going to ask those questions and many more. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. It's been a week since violence between white supremacists and counter-protesters erupted in Charlottesville in the U.S. When the entire nation has been watching every tweet from the president, Trump's remarks have disappointed some Americans. His comments do little to cure the deeply rooted problems in the U.S. society, some say. Take a look.
US President Donald Trump said there are fine people among white supremacists was certainly not the only wording that offended Americans. In fact, he couldn't help but defend the white supremacist who started the violence.
There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, or you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. So you can say what you want, but that's the way it is.
The violence centered on a statue of Robert E. Lee, a leading figure in the South Rebellion in America's Civil War 150 years ago. Far-right groups descended on Charlottesville to protest a plan to remove the monument. Many believe Trump needs to be taught how to react as a US president on this issue. Former presidential candidate John McCain tweeted, "There's no moral equivalence between racists and Americans standing up to defy hate and bigotry. The President of the United States should say so." The first African-American US President Barack Obama tweeted, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love." And his tweets garnered 2.8 million likes. Not only have politicians openly voiced their disappointment at Trump, another one of his advisory groups, composed of CEOs, has abandoned the president. Kenneth Frazier, the CEO of Merck, was the first to quit American Manufacturing Council. The head of the pharma giant said his decision was a matter of personal conscience. Other executives from Fortune 500 companies soon followed suit, including Intel's CEO, who called on all leaders to condemn white supremacists. Critics of Trump say his recent outburst is just the latest in a long line of racially charged comments going back to when Trump announced he was running for president in 2015.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
A memorial service was held Wednesday for Heather Heyer, the 32-year-old woman killed last Saturday in Charlottesville. Even many Trump supporters say instead of unifying America, he is aggravating an already emotional issue.
So what is at the core of the latest chaos going in the United States? Joining us in Bloomington, Indiana, in the U.S., Matthew Hambach, who is the chairman of the Traditional Worker Party, also known as a party that is representing white supremacists. So let me ask you, Mr. Hambach, first of all, welcome to our program. Secondly, what do you make of President Trump's remarks recently and many people's counter-arguments against what he exactly said?
Well, it's an honor to be here, and the most important thing to realize about the event is Mr. Trump is correct. We were there to be able to exercise our rights, to stand up for our heritage, to be able to advocate for the best interests of our community, and we were attacked by radical anarchists, radical left-wingers that wanted to use violence, that used knives, that used bleach they tried to throw in our eyes, that they used baseball bats, that they were assaulting us, bringing an assault upon us when we defended ourselves. So Mr. Trump identifying what happened.
But 3 people were killed.
Being the victims of an assault is very important.
3 people were killed, not from your camp, but rather from the other camp.
Yes, the radical leftists, their chants they were doing were about killing us. They were very, very violent. This is a history in America of political violence.
But
by the
what I'm saying, sir,
left
is that a person died from the other camp, from your camp. So, okay, how can you explain that?
The vehicle that Mr. Fields was driving was struck with baseball bats, was attacked by the radical leftists, and in that case, he feared for his life. This is an example.
And therefore,
of the
he
radical
go
left
to
in
the
America
others, use the
committing
car
violence.
to crash the others?
Yes, the radical leftists were attacking his vehicle. As you can see in the videos, his windshield was smashed, his car was smashed.
Let's move to the other question. What is going to be the use of parties like yours in the United States? Is it going to make your country ever more peaceful and diversified? Is it going to make your country respected elsewhere in the world? Mr. Hambach.
We as the Traditionalist Worker Party believe in a post-global multipolar world. We want to be able to work with allies around the world to respect
Who are your allies?
Influence. Our allies, we support the Eurasian movement, Professor Alexander Dugin, speaking about a safer, more prosperous world
for
each country. For all peoples. We believe that, for instance, China and the DPRK have their own sphere of influence. Russia has theirs. And we, as white nationalists in our community, as patriots that believe we have a duty and honor and responsibility to our ancestors and our descendants to have control of our own destiny and to bring peace to the world.
Last but certainly not least, the very last question for you, this time at least. Mr. Hambach, you see the statues of some of the earlier symbols of white supremacists have been removed from Charlottesville, from some of the other cities in the United States as well. Some say this is going to be a wrapping up period, decades and hundreds of years following the Civil War. What do you make of it? Do you think your organization will still have any space in your future in terms of in the U.S. society and being accepted by the others? Mr. Hambach.
The assault upon our heritage is by, pardon my pronunciation, the Baizu, the white liberals that hate culture, they hate identity, they hate tradition, and they want to bring anarchy to our streets. They want to disrupt our society. We are advocating for our people, for our heritage, and for our children to have a political voice to bring peace, prosperity, not only to us, but to all people.
So actually you hate all of the others?
No, we want to be able to work with all different other groups. That's why we work with communities of color. We do outreach to nationalist groups around the world, and we believe in a world that is post-global, that is multipolar, where we work together as one for a more peaceful planet.
Matthew Hambach, coming from Indiana, Bloomington. Thank you for being with us. So what is really going on in the United States? Those are the words coming only from one camp and one extreme camp. We want to bring those words to you to understand the basis that we are talking about related to the chaos going on in the United States earlier this week. But for now, we're going to loop in our panelists. What is the word on racial tensions in the U.S.? Helping us to understand the real situation. Beijing studio, Da Wei, who is the director, the American Studies of China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations. Sir, welcome to our program. In Washington, D.C., we have Brandon Andrews, a former U.S. Senate staff who is representing, I guess, the Republican side for us, the director now of Impact. And also in Chicago, U.S., we have Laura Schwartz, a political commentator who has worked at the White House during the Clinton years. Ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure to have the three of you. Earlier, you heard the words from one camp and one extreme camp. It would help us to understand how deep the water is in the United States right now. Laura, I want to have your very short response to what Mr. Hambach just said.
It's incredibly disturbing, to say the least. And these groups that this man represents may be on the fringe, but they're certainly getting a lot of cover from President Trump and a lot of coverage. And that's very concerning to me and much of America.
Mr. Andrews as well.
Well, this is really an opportunity for Republicans and the Republican Party at every level, local, state, and federal, to once and for all disavow white supremacy and distance itself from groups like those represented by the guest. Mr. Trump has certainly made it much more difficult for Republicans to move positive policy agendas forward and to continue to reach out to more diverse communities and bring them in and do good things for them. But we have to disavow this. We have to move past this and move beyond this. And quite frankly, when you talk about culture and heritage, many of those Confederate statues were erected in the 20s and 30s and were erected to represent white supremacy in communities and to represent public places where immigrants, African Americans, etc., could not go. And so we need to remove those pieces as well.
Right. Of course, we heard very different voices coming from the other two panelists. I guess mainly represent big voices here in the United States. Mr. Da Wei, from, of course, we are only observing what's going on in that country, but as a researcher of American study, you see the waves of debates going on and even some violence going on throughout the years. What do you make of the latest situation?
I think now the U.S. politics has already entered a new era, that the race politics has emerged. After 1960s, I think the race relations become relatively calm, but in recent years it re-emerged. I think even from the Obama administration, the Obama era, and now I think the victory of the President Trump in the election emboldened or encouraged those white supremacists and the white nationalist voice in the United States. I think, in the U.S., of course, we know in the society, in the political life, there is political correctness. I think this is very useful latch to lock to leash the white nationalism, the white supremacist sentiments in the United States. But I think the rhetorics and some of the policies that President Trump has staged, I think, encouraged them and unleashed that sentiment, let them out of the box.
The question is, what about the Republican Party? Is the Republican Party in ally with President Trump to create the current situation, or at least creating conditions for the current situation? Mr. Andrews.
Well, no, the Republican Party isn't an ally to white supremacy. It's not an ally to white supremacist groups. It's not an ally to those who believe in racism, sexism, etc. However, the Republican Party has not done a good enough job of distancing itself from these groups. It has not done a good enough job historically of ensuring that the policies that are being put in place by the party reflect a more diverse country. And so there's certainly blame to be laid at the feet of the Republican Party when you have the leader of the party, who is Mr. Donald Trump, who's the president, saying these things and continuing to dissemble and to make the waters murky about his association with folks like David Duke and others who believe in white supremacy. But no, this isn't a Republican thing. This is a white supremacy thing, and they have found a home in the Republican Party, and we need to do our best to push them out.
Ms. Schwartz, do you agree with that distinction that Mr. Andrew made, which is they are finding a base in the Republican Party but not representing the Republican Party at all?
I do completely agree with Brendan on this, because you saw all these Trump T-shirts that the white supremacists were wearing in Charlottesville. You see them speaking more freely because they think that Donald Trump has given them the opportunity to do so. You've seen the former Grand Wizard of the KKK white supremacist group come out and thank President Trump for his support. I've been very proud of the Republicans in the Congress who have tweeted and put out statements and called out President Trump by name from the stage. Right now in America, the Congress of the United States, which convenes in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. to legislate throughout the year, are back in their home districts for the month of August. They're meeting with their constituents one-on-one in town halls. And so they're hearing their dismay. And I think it's wonderful that they're taking a chance to disavow these comments by the president specifically, especially, as well as all of it. And I believe that there could be a wonderful opportunity for the Republican Party, which is being taken down by Donald Trump right now, to return to Congress after the recess, work with the Democrats, and really set forth better laws against hate crimes and more strategy on restrictions. So this could be an opportunity. I think the Congress has got to take this country into their hands and out of those of Donald Trump right now.
Mr. Andrews, on the other hand, we heard about the spat of words between President Trump and also Lindsey Graham, of course, a Republican senator, talking about exactly what President Trump said. President Trump, of course, is trying to deny all the negatives associated with what his words were, according to Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham is stating his original stand. So how should we understand the fight between these two men in a way between President Trump and the establishment of the Republican Party?
Well, Lindsey Graham is certainly right in this instance, and Senator McConnell, who's the majority leader in the Senate side, Paul Ryan, who of course is the Speaker of the House, and Ms. Romney, who is the chairwoman of the RNC, have all come out with statements against what Mr. Trump has said and have all disavowed the KKK, white supremacy, etc. But we have to go a further step by having, I believe, the Republican conference, when you come back in the House and the Senate, actually release a statement and say, hey, this is not what we stand for. And something that the Republicans in Congress could do is begin the removal of Confederate statues that are in Statuary Hall and also placed in other places around the halls of Congress. It really is up to the states to be able to make the final decision there on whether or not those statues stay. However, releasing some kind of statement from the conference, I think, would be the right thing to do in this case, and would hopefully help continue to distance the party from these folks that really have nothing to do with what Republicans have stood for over the years, and we can't continue to allow it to be murky in terms
Mr.
of
Da,
our
here in
association.
Beijing, I do have two questions for you. One is the statues is one thing. We heard and we saw political statues being removed in one country or the other. Eventually, some with some follow-up actions, some without real actions and without real results as being expected. And the other thing is people have been criticizing, been pressure from his own parties on him, but he's a very, in a way, strong political figure. Is this going to be some of the so-called last straw on his back as a political figure in the U.S. politics? Two questions for you, very different direction. Mr. Da, first one.
I think I'd like to answer the second question first.
Go ahead.
I don't think, of course, this new latest event, I think, created a lot of trouble and pressure for President Trump. But I think in terms of his political future, I think it still depends on, particularly depends on his relationship with the Republican establishment, the Republican congressman and woman in the Congress. So I don't think it's serious enough to, to have really serious impact on his political future. But of course, created difficult. And for the status, I think this is I think this is a kind of another, I call it, new chapter of the culture war in the United States. It's very controversial issue, and different people have different view on those. Like Robert Lee, I agree with our American colleagues. I think this is an issue that should be decided by the state and by the law. But now I think the key issue is the culture war between traditional old American, a white American, with a diversified new American, new U.S. I think what we are witness is this new development in the United States.
Very important comments, I would say. Mr. Schwartz, we see events revolving racial issues every year happen from time to time. But the question really is, how much has the U.S. changed? How much the realities on the ground is likely to grab the directions of politics in the United States? We have seen some recent events going on, whether it's about immigrants, whether it's about a stepping down of a president who's the first African American in the United States. But what would all of these mean eventually? It's a big question mark Mr. Da earlier raised for us. Ms. Schwartz.
It's a very good question, Tian, because we've seen an evolution both with the Barack Obama presidency of the first African American, of which he was very successful, jobs in other areas. And then we've now moved into a very hot contested race last year in a campaign with Donald Trump, where there was very loose talk about immigrants and threats of violence at his rallies. And then now we're here in a presidency, and I do not believe that Donald Trump has moved from running for president versus being president, which I think is very detrimental. But I think what is very telling, which is really worrying to me, is that President Trump's base support is still there. And only about 52% disagreed with him this week out of his support, and that just seems like a very high number that still do support his comments on Charlottesville. But I think it's interesting to realize that when even Richard Nixon was impeached, he had a 32% approval rating. But again, when you look inside the numbers, it does give me worry. You've got to disavow the president, these other Republicans running for re-election next year. But I think you have to do more than disavow. You need to take some action. And I'm worried that they're worried to take action because he still has this number attached to him. I believe, though, in light of everything, if you stand out and stand up, you'll be given credit for it.
Okay. I want to, before we go back to Mr. Andrews. You're an African American. You're also related to the Republican Party, so you are probably more closely linked to what we're talking about today than any one of us. What do you make of what Ms. Schwartz just said? What are the real actions do you think the Republican Party and President Trump should take in order to make sure the opinions and views are well understood and the country is going in the right direction? Mr. Andrews, very briefly from you, but concrete points.
Sure. Thank you. I grew up in a small town in South Alabama. Many of you will know the history there in Alabama in terms of slavery, the civil rights movement, etc. The removal of these statues, Republican Governor Rick Scott in Florida signed an order to remove a Confederate statue representing Florida that's in the United States Congress building already last year. And so the fact that removal of these statues is happening means that we're making progress. However, we're not where we need to be yet. And currently, President Donald Trump's statements are keeping us from being able to make the progress that we need to make as a country so that we can all move forward together and so that we can get to the infrastructure plans, and we can get to tax reform, so we can get to health care. We can't get to any of those things because of this distraction right now. And so as an African American in the United States of America, I'm happy to see the progress that we're making, but Republicans have to Mr. Schwartz's point, come against Donald Trump and make sure that it's not just words, but also actions.
We're running out of time, but thank you so much for your analysis, particularly following up with the previous interview. Really appreciate it. Da Wei, Brandon Andrews, and Laura Schwartz. Thank you for being with us. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight with Tianwei CGTN in your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel as well. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and City Weibo. You can see those links on our screen. From me, Tianwei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for insights across China and around the world. Good night.